Chapter 6. God Determines Leaders. I'd like you to recall an example I shared in the prior chapter with the Pick Your Own Adventure book. God, as the author, has filled the story with leaders who do good and leaders who do evil. Sometimes in the story, you, as the reader, get to pick which leader to follow, but other times, events and circumstances make someone a leader. Even though you may try to orchestrate a certain outcome with your choices, it doesn't always play out like you envisioned. That's because a good story has twists, challenges, and unexpected heroes. It's exactly like this in real life, too. Many people get anxious about elections because they so desperately want the candidate they voted for to win. After the 2016 national election, I saw my doctor for my annual visit. She asked me if I was upset, anxious, or depressed about the election results because she'd seen a high number of patients who exhibited those traits and required medication to help them cope. That made me sad because it illustrated a lack of faith. Whatever happens that puts a leader into authority, remember that God is the author. He's planned every outcome and knows how the story ends. Focus on doing your part in the story. Participate and make good choices. Keep turning the page. If you've put your faith in Jesus, then you have no reason to be anxious. Your eternal future is secure. Let's look at some examples from the Bible that help us understand God's role as the author of the story. In this scripture, the prophet Daniel reveals that God both establishes and removes kings. Daniel answered, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are His. He changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings." Daniel 2:20-21. Paul the Apostle tells us all authority comes from God. Let every soul be in subjection to the higher authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those who exist are ordained by God. Romans 13:1. It also reveals something else that's interesting. He said every soul is subject to higher authority. That means the leader that God put into power is subject to God too. He or she is accountable for their actions, just like you and me are. That's why Paul said leaders need to take the gift of leadership that God bestowed on them seriously. Romans 12:8. God expects a leader to be a good shepherd. They will answer for it if they aren't. That's right. God puts both good and bad leaders into power. I know some of you may think God only puts good leaders into power, and that sinful people are the ones who put evil leaders into power. No, that's not the case. All leaders have free will. They can choose to obey God or chase after sin. They also both serve a purpose. Some of you may be thinking of Hosea 8:4 to counter the points I just made about God picking leaders. Let's have a look at it. "They have set up kings, but not by me. They have made princes, and I didn't approve. Of their silver and their gold they have made themselves idols, that they may be cut off." Hosea 8:4. If you just read the first scripture above, it seems like the people somehow thwarted God's plan and picked a leader He didn't ordain, almost like they were able to write a character into God's own story. When we keep reading, we see what this is really about. They're idols. They made themselves kings and princes that God didn't approve of out of gold and silver. They created false gods they could worship. Let's read about a real human king that God picked. God chose King David to be king over all of Israel. We regard David as a good king, yet we know that David wasn't perfect by any means. He committed adultery with Bathsheba, got her pregnant, and had her husband killed in battle to cover it up. 2 Samuel 11-12. We also know that David was accountable to God for that sinful behavior because God took the son that resulted from that sin. David still ended up in God's hall of faith. Hebrews 11:32. His next son with Bathsheba, Solomon, built the first temple, and it's through David's descendants that Jesus was born. God still picked David even though He knew all those bad choices he would make. "Now therefore tell my servant David this. Yahweh of armies says, I took you from the sheep pen, from following the sheep, to be prince over my people, over Israel. 2 Samuel 7:8. Perhaps you're wondering why God chose David. It's because David had a heart like God's. 1 Samuel 13:14. In a subsequent chapter, we're going to look at the qualities that make a good leader. This is one of them. Even though God picked David, we read in chapter 1 that the people chose him. 2 Samuel 2:4. So which is it? Who picked David, God or the people? Both did. Let's look at another leader God picked, Nebuchadnezzar. You likely know him as the evil ruler of Babylon who conquered Israel and took them into captivity. Yes, God picked the bad guy. Jeremiah the prophet spoke to all the people of Judah and to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Yet you have not listened to me, says Yahweh, that you may provoke me to anger with the work of your hands to your own hurt. Therefore, Yahweh of armies says, because you have not heard my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, says Yahweh, and I will send to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land, and against its inhabitants, and against all these nations around. It will happen when 70 years are accomplished, that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, says Yahweh, for their iniquity. Jeremiah 25:2, 7-9, and 12. God referred to Nebuchadnezzar as his servant. God used him and his army to discipline Israel because they kept sinning by worshiping false gods. This isn't a leader the people of Israel chose per se, because they certainly didn't elect him, but their choices resulted in him being their leader. So in a sense, they did pick him. We also read above that God promised to hold Nebuchadnezzar accountable for his own sins too. Let's see what happened. All this came on the king Nebuchadnezzar. The king spoke and said, Is not this great Babylon, which I have built for the royal dwelling place by the might of my power, and for the glory of my majesty? While the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from the sky, saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. This was fulfilled the same hour on Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men and ate grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of the sky until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom from generation to generation. Daniel 4:28, 30-31, 33-34. Nebuchadnezzar was prideful and thought he had built Babylon by his own strength. After God humbled him, we learn that Nebuchadnezzar praised God. You see, that was God's ultimate reason for disciplining both Israel and Nebuchadnezzar. It's so they would come to know him and put their faith in him. God uses all types of people and leaders to bring about his will. The prophet Isaiah received this message from God that reiterates this important truth for us. Yahweh says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held to subdue nations before him, and strip kings of their armor, to open the doors before him, and the gates shall not be shut. I will go before you and make the rough places smooth. I will break the doors of bronze in pieces and cut apart the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that you may know that it is I, Yahweh, who calls you by your name, even the God of Israel. I have given you a title, though you have not known me. I am Yahweh, and there is no one else. Besides me, there is no God. I will strengthen you, though you have not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is no one besides me. I am Yahweh, and there is no one else. I have raised him up in righteousness, and I will make all his ways straight. He shall build my city, and he shall let my exiles go free, not for price nor reward, says Yahweh of armies. Isaiah 45, 1 through 6 and 13. Cyrus was one of Nebuchadnezzar's successors. He was one of the kings over Babylon while the Israelites were in captivity there. God called him his anointed. That means he was divinely chosen by God. We also learn that even though Cyrus didn't know God, that God held his hand. God was with him. I hope that brings you comfort like it does me. God is with the leaders he picks. So why did God pick an unbeliever like Cyrus to lead the people? He told us, that you may know that it is I, and that they may know I am Yahweh. God picked Cyrus so he could reveal himself to Cyrus and the people of Israel. It's the same reason he picked Nebuchadnezzar. We should look at all of our leaders through this lens. How is God using the leader to reveal himself? Now that we understand that God picks leaders, good and bad ones, to reveal himself to us, let's look at other ways God uses leaders. Peter tells us, they are sent for our good because they honor those who do right and they punish those who do wrong. 1 Peter 2, 13 through 14. We learn in Judges 17:6 that when the people didn't have a leader, that each person did whatever seemed right to them. This tells us that leaders help guide us in doing what's right. However, since all leaders are sinners, it means they could guide us down the wrong path too. In that case, God uses the leader to give us the opportunity to choose good or evil, to choose if we'll serve God above all else. Acts 5:29, Joshua 24:15. God uses leaders the world considers foolish to shame people who think they are wise. He picks people to lead who seem powerless in order to shame the powerful. Both the foolish and the powerless are used to show the world that what they consider important isn't. They both put an end to people boasting about their own strength. 1 Corinthians 1, 27 through 28. Consider Moses and all of the disciples that Jesus picked. Moses was 80 years old when God chose him, and he wasn't a good speaker. The disciples whom God entrusted to lead the early church and spread the gospel were mostly fishermen. How about King David? He was a shepherd, and yet God chose him to display his power among the people. Isaiah 55:4. Since we're all accountable to God as our maker, he's also our judge, so he sends leaders like Nebuchadnezzar and the Assyrian king to discipline sin and wickedness. Jeremiah 25, Isaiah 10. When God allows a leader to discipline the people, there's always a limit he places on them. Jesus himself told us that when the Antichrist is in power, there will be greater oppression at that time than there ever has been or will be. But God chose to shorten the days for the sake of people who put their faith in him during that time. Mark 13, 19 through 20. Any evil ruler, even if they are inhabited by Satan or another fallen angel, are also under Jesus' authority. Not in the future. They are right now. Jesus Christ, who is at the right hand of God, having gone into heaven, angels and authorities and powers being made subject to him. 1 Peter 3, 21 through 22. That means, just like he did with Job, Satan still has to get permission from Jesus before he can test anyone. Job 1. If God allows it, remember that God is in control and that it's for your benefit. God is using that ruler and the difficult time to help you know him and bring you closer to him. Don't lose hope. God also uses leaders like Moses, Cyrus, and Gideon to rescue people from oppression. Exodus 3, Isaiah 45, Judges 6. We know how this story ends. Jesus is coming. Revelation 22. You may think that because God is choosing the leaders that there's no reason for you to vote. That's not the case. If you're still struggling with why you should vote, I encourage you to reread chapter 1 and remember all the reasons your vote truly matters to God. Also, remember the Pick Your Own Adventure book example. You're like the reader. The pages of the book won't turn themselves. You have to make a choice and flip to the next page. In this Laodicean culture we're in, there's enormous pressure to sit on the sidelines and not do anything. That's exactly what Satan hopes you'll do too. It'd be like letting someone else make the choice in the story and turn the page. But then it wouldn't be your adventure anymore, would it? Satan will most certainly take control of your part if you let him. Don't forfeit your choice and the path the story takes to Satan. Now, let's consider who Jesus and Satan would vote for.